Hello. In my session last week, I looked at employment and how that works for deaf people, just their level of access to employment, whether that's in London, where opportunities seem to be great for deaf people, for them to access employment, or in the Southeast, and issues around that because of openness to people who are different, but those who are disabled or for LGBTQI groups. And so I looked at that about how employment is different in different areas. But now I want to think about access to work and how that relates to this whole area. Because many employers of companies or organizations are actually unaware of the scheme and how access to work can be used to support deaf people employment. Now, the government actually issued this grant. So, say a deaf or disabled person applies for a position and they alert you to the fact that they need assistance. So, for example, if I was entering the workplace, I would need assistance with communication. And for me, that would be an interpreter for someone to do translation work with me. But how do they get paid? And that's what this fund is all about. It's about providing funding for assistance in the workplace to help you. And so for me, that would be an interpreter to make sure that I don't have any barriers in the workplace. So what's important is, say you had a company and their turnover was millions of pounds. So Access to Work would do an assessment of that company, that employer or that company. And after such an assessment, they might decide that the employer has to contribute a certain percentage towards that support, whether that be 30%. And then Access to Work would put the remaining 70% into that budget. Now, if somebody is self employed, so they run their own business as a deaf or disabled person, Access to Work will actually fund 100% of that support. So it really depends. And so for some companies, they may have a turnover of £1 million, but Access to Work might decide to just fund that in its entirety. So what that means is Access to Work is actually a really useful fund for those who are wanting to get into employment, for those who are deaf or disabled. And so how do you apply for it? Well, say you had a deaf person and they are offered a position in a company, they would then have to approach Access to Work and put in an application for funding. They will then make contact with the company, whether that's a line manager, to find out about their role and responsibilities. And once they've gone through that, an award letter will be issued stating how many hours per week, say, an interpreter can be used. That will be signed off by the relevant parties, and things would go from there. So then every month, invoices will be received from interpreters, say. The deaf person would sign that, the employer would sign that, and those claim forms would go off to Access to Work and payments made to the relevant people. And so, as a self employed person, I would take on ownership of that. So, I would fill in the form. The interpreter that I'm working with will do their part on the form, and Access to Work will make payment to the interpreter. That's how Access to Work is used. It's such a useful scheme. It allows deaf people access to employment without facing any barriers. So this fund is so useful for deaf people. So I'm hoping this has been a beneficial session for you today. Okay, so thank you for watching. Farewell.